everyone. Welcome to the morning show. We're coming to you this morning on Channel 9 on WJOP-LP Newburyport, FM 96.3. We're also live streaming on Newburyport Community Media's YouTube channel at ncmhub.org. I'm your host, Mary Jacobsen, and I'm just delighted to welcome today's guest. Noel Dominguez is here, and he's going to teach us about implicit bias. You know, I wanted to do a show on this topic because I think many of us, or I'll speak for myself personally, may think we understand implicit bias, but I know I could use a deeper view into how it works, how it impacts our behavior and our relationships, and especially how do we excavate these biases if we're not always conscious of having them. So Noel is here to help us dig into that. He's a PhD candidate in philosophy at Harvard, and he's the author of a very thoughtful essay titled Moral Responsibility for Implicit Bias, Examining Our Options, which will be a chapter in the book Introduction to Implicit Bias, Knowledge, Justice, and the Social Mind. At Harvard, Noel has taught courses on free will and the philosophy of race. He's also the Diversity, Belonging, Inclusion, and Equity Program Manager at the Trustees of Reservations. So Noel, first off, hello, welcome, and thank you so much for visiting the morning show today.
Hi there. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here and hope we can all learn a bit more about implicit bias today.
I hope we can too, and thank you so much, Noel. Well, let's start with the basics, Noel. What is implicit bias, and can you give us some examples of it?
Sure. So a good way to think about what an implicit bias is to talk about how we discovered them or the test we use to check for them. This is called the implicit association test. And the way that it works is you're given two concepts, like say good and bad, and then you're given two sets of images. So we'll say, so for example, sets of white faces and sets of black faces. And then you're given what should be a pretty simple task, which is they tell you, say, whenever a white face comes up, put it in the pile for good. Whenever a black face comes up, put it in a pile for bad. Do it as quickly as you can. People can do it quickly, people can do it well. And then they ask you to do it again the other way around. They say now when they come up, put the white faces in the bad pile and the black faces in the good pile. And overwhelmingly, people have much more difficulty doing this. They don't do it as quickly. They make more mistakes. This is the implicit association task. You can do it with different sets of images and different concepts. And when we talk about implicit associations, for example, the scenario I just described would suggest that you would have an implicit association between whiteness and goodness, or between blackness and badness. That it is easier for you to connect black faces with bad than it would be white faces with bad. So that's what implicit associations are. And the reason they're so important is so much discriminatory behavior that happens these days does not seem to be the result of people having conscious bad attitudes. It's no longer the case, say, that the reason we think that hiring can be so unequal, why white candidates get hired more than black candidates with similar resumes, is it's not because the hiring manager is looking at these and thinking, I don't want to hire the black person. Instead, it looks like implicit biases are playing a role here. So that's what the biases are. That's why they're important, and it's part of why I'm so concerned about them.
Yeah. So based on what you're saying, then these are really associations. They're not verbal, they're not intentional, and not the way we want to be thinking. It's faster than thought, it sounds like. It's literally an association. It's the neurons firing. But when you do a test like the very interesting one you just described, it's data. It shows us, you can see the difference in the difficulty people have making the association between this, in the example you gave, whiteness and goodness, blackness and badness. And then it just kind of is proof that those associations are happening, even if we're not aware that that's happening. Well, this raises a question I've been eager to ask you about how the name implicit bias came up, Noel, because to me, the name itself may engender a little bit of confusion or misunderstanding, because we think of implicit as the contrary to explicit, which is analogous to direct or indirect, spoken or unspoken, explained or implied. And we may speak indirectly or in euphemisms, but we're aware of what we're doing when we're doing that. You have to think around to find a euphemism if you don't want to say something directly. So I've often wondered if the phrase subconscious bias might be more accurate, or is there a reason why the frame of implicit bias took hold and the reasons why it should stay in place?
Well, so the reason it took hold was just because explicit bias was already a subject of study. Implicit bias is the contrast to that one. That's how the term took place. But I will say that these days it's used pretty interchangeably with unconscious bias. So definitely people using the term implicit bias aren't quite trying to get around talking about unconscious bias. Curiously, I actually think both of these are a little misleading in the sense that implicit biases aren't always that implicit. We have some evidence that shows that people are sometimes aware of having them. The simple reason being the best predictor for whether you have an implicit bias is when you are asked in a survey, do you think you have this bias? People tend to be right about that.
Interesting.
You know, if asked to answer honestly and told there won't be repercussions for it. Likewise, when people do the implicit association test, people say that they can feel like directly that it is harder for them to sort the tasks in the reversed manner. So it's on the periphery of consciousness. It's not exactly unconscious. And a curious thing about implicit racial biases, implicit biases around social identities in general, is that when we talk about implicit racial biases, a lot of times we talk about this character that I brought up in the beginning, that the explicit biases are different than the implicit biases. Explicitly, you might have neutral or positive associations towards non-white minorities, and yet you take the implicit association test, you don't get that result. But in a lot of implicit bias studies that are for things like marketing and branding, your explicit and implicit biases line up. Your explicit bias is about, say, whether Apple is a cool tech company. Your implicit biases point the same way. It's only with these socially laden categories that we have this disjunct going on.
Okay, that's really interesting, Noel. Thank you for that. That makes a lot of sense to me. So one of the other things I've been curious to ask you, and it kind of follows from what we're talking, what's the difference between implicit bias? Is it in generalizations or stereotypes or categories, which we all have and generally know that we have them? So is it the same or is it different?
Well, I guess the answer would say that implicit biases, when we are thinking of them as associations, they're relations between concepts. So your implicit bias isn't a concept, it's two concepts having a closer linking than two other concepts, essentially. The reason that that's important to keep in mind is the content of the concepts determines the content of the bias. So I'll give you an example of how this works. Off the top of your head, name like two kinds of birds.
Robin, blue jay.
Robin, blue jay, woodpecker, things like that are what people say. They don't say penguin, they don't say emu, they don't say ostrich. These are just as much birds as any of the other birds you would have listed, but they're not the thing that comes to mind when you think of the category bird or the clip bird.
Right.
This is how implicit biases function. What's going on is not probably that you say have like deeply negative associations with non-white people, and that's why you do worse on the IAT. Instead, it's just that your exemplars for the concept of goodness, what you have in mind when you think of things that are good, are more like white faces than they are like black faces. Your stand-in for that concept is white encoded, even if you didn't realize it was.
Oh, that is so helpful, Noel. Thank you for that. I totally understand what you're saying, and it makes sense, and it is a way in which the readiness of these associations are right there. Maybe subliminal might be a good word. So thank you for that. That's very helpful. Well, I'm also curious to find out, Noel, if these are associations that we're making, is it, and they derive from, cultural experiences that we have or interpersonal experiences that we have. is this type of associational or implicit bias an unavoidable aspect of how our brains are simply wired, how our neurology works to perceive and make categories as we experience life coming at us, or as we see TV shows or films, or have, experiences with different groups or people, or don't have experiences with them. All we have are the cultural representations of them, which are not ever going to be totally representative of any group. So is it simply a manifestation of the way that our brains are wired to perceive and categorize necessarily, but also inherently then simplify or oversimplify reality and our perceptions?
Well, I guess I'd say yes and no to that. One thing that's unavoidable is just, if you're someone who has to use multiple concepts and the concepts tend to be paired in certain ways, just as part of how the brain organizes functions, those concepts are going to come closer together in your thought.
Yeah.
And an interesting example of this is that when we talk about associations, sometimes people emphasize that when you have an association with a concept, that by itself doesn't imply anything about what the relationship actually is. It's just that when one comes to mind, the other comes to mind. So if you think of salt, the association for most people would be pepper. And that doesn't mean that they prefer salt over pepper or the other way around. Yeah. But my father, who worked in construction, I one time asked him what's his immediate association with salt. And he said roads.
Yes.
Because he was thinking about salt clearing out snow. And this is the thing. It's unavoidable to have an association. The content of the association is something that can change based on your experiences and based on the culture we're in. That you have implicit biases is unavoidable. That you have the implicit biases you in particular have, that's not unavoidable.
Right. That's not your neurology, it's your experience. And I suppose the work that you put into being conscious of the associations that you're making. Well, I also wanted to find out, is implicit bias, is it always directed outward at the other or at other groups? Or can it equally impact our perceptions of the groups that we ourselves belong to?
So this is a subject of debate that I don't think has been settled yet. What I can say is this. In general, we tend to form implicit biases in favor of groups we're members of, against groups we're not members of. This is not always the case. And in particular, if you're a member of an out group, you still have a good chance of having a negative perception of the group you belong to. Being a non-white person does not guarantee that you'll get a better score on the non-white IAT than a white person would. But so much of this research has been about how groups tend to do things, how things come out when we look at large swaths of people, that the general question of for any individual person, what we can say is that they have certain biases. And if they take the test, we can see what they are. But why they have those instead of others, it's not very clear. So.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that makes sense. And of course, it makes sense that whether you're a majority group or a minority group, we, by definition, if we're part of a majority group, minority groups are living within the majority culture and the associations are there. And so it makes sense, although it's sad to think about, it's sad to think that we're all internalizing certain kinds of implicit biases that can be harmful. And in fact, that's the next thing I wanted to ask you to talk to us about, Noel, is why is it important that we understand implicit biases, what they are, how they function in us, and more generally within our culture? Why does it matter, both for our society and our communities, and also for each of us as individuals?
So I think it matters for a lot of reasons. One of the main reasons to understand it would just be that unless we know how these mechanisms work, we're in the dark about what to do about them.
Yeah.
And so in particular, suppose that you are concerned about, say, unequal hiring rates at the company you work at. You're in HR and you notice we tend to hire a lot more male candidates than female candidates for certain positions. Well, if we didn't have an understanding of implicit bias, you might go about doing the wrong kinds of things to make it better. So you might think that you need to like sit down your hiring managers and tell them, like, we need to hire more women. So evaluate these applications more carefully. It isn't clear that your advice would connect with the issue. One reason that I think this matters for ourselves, though, is just it's an important part of our picture of ourselves as human agents. We tend to think of ourselves as by ourselves coming up with the actions we do. A lot of the implicit bias research shows that the framing around the choices you make can play a big role in why you make those choices in ways you can't notice. And I just think for our own understanding, this is a very good thing to keep in mind. And I'll give you another example of what I mean by that is, say that, for example, right now, someone came up to you and said, hey, I need 2 books for a middle school language arts class. Tell me 2 books they could read.
Middle school language arts, Catcher in the Rye, Franny and Zoe.
Those are great choices. And what's interesting here is not those choices in particular, but it's easy to forget all the things you could have said that never even came up as options. So like the dictionary is a book. It is not a book anyone would ever say to this. And this is the important part. It's not because you were like, should I say the dictionary? And then went, no, it didn't even come up because you already have an idea of the kinds of books we should assign for this. This idea that your cognition is structured around these kinds of examples, that before you start thinking, that already takes effect. I just think that's a very important thing for people to understand when you think, oh, why did that person do that? Why do these things happen? That's a big part of the story. So
that's a great example. Those are just two books that I loved. And they just came right to mind because I was picturing myself at that age. And that was the age at which I loved both of those books. I still love them. And so you're absolutely right, Noel, you explained it very well, that if we don't understand the rapidity of our associations and where they're coming from, we'll be making almost automated kind of responses and choices, which are rarely going to be, sometimes may overlap with thoughtful, reflective. They may wind up, in some cases being the best choices, but more often than not, my guess would be they're not going to be given time to reflect. I mean, we need dictionaries, so that's really fascinating. Thank you for that. And I think built into that answer is part of the answer to something else I wanted to ask you about, which is, as you were saying, we like to think of ourselves as unbiased and fair-minded people, and we can be that and still harbor implicit biases because of the way they form and the way they function. And I was going to ask you, given that that is the case, what an endeavor to try and understand our own biases. I mean, there's the test that you pointed out, but short of that, how do we excavate them? How do we mine for them? Since a lot of the times they're kind of latent. And I think what you just described as a kind of almost automated associational process means probably pausing for a moment before making a decision, pausing before you assume that if you're supposed to hire more women or more representatives of other groups, that just reading their resume twice isn't necessarily going to impact your decisions unless you come up with a more thoughtful and reflective way to give yourself time in the mental and emotional space to expand your range of choices and think about other criteria. Does that make sense to you, Noel? Is that what you would recommend?
Absolutely.
Or other things that you would suggest?
I'd say here's the most important thing I've learned about implicit biases and managing them, in our lives, in the place, etc. It comes from this 2015 study by Ullman and Cohen, if anyone later wants to look this up. And they brought people in and they gave them this kind of test. They say, hey, look, we're hiring for a new police commissioner. and they give you two kinds of resumes. And one of them, and they tell you, it's important that this person knows a lot about what it's like to be a cop on the street and that they have a high level of formal education. That's all you know. So they bring you two resumes. Well, one of them, the person has a lot of street experience but doesn't have much formal education. The other one, the candidate has a lot of formal education but doesn't have much on the street experience. Which should you pick here? And it's a bit of a trick question, because the answer for what people tend to pick is whichever one has the male name on it.
Okay, interesting.
When one has a male name and one has a female name, whichever one has the male name, that's the one they pick. And when you ask them why, they don't say because it has a male name. They say, oh, well, I thought about it, and it turned out that I thought this was more important than that for this position. And they'll say education if the male name had education. They'll say on the street experience if the male name had street experience. What's happening here, and this, I'll get to answering your question now, is that we talk a lot about implicit biases when we talk about the implicit association test in terms of having to do things quickly. When you're trying to do things quickly, you don't have time to think through it consciously, and then implicit biases are able to do something. But that's not the only instance in which implicit biases affect your actions. They also affect your actions when you are holistically evaluating ambiguous data. When you need to pick between two things and you don't have clear guidelines on how to do it, what you're going to do, not consciously, is you're going to look at these two and you're going to go, who looks more like a police commissioner to me? And then the fact that your image of a police commissioner tends to be male is going to be what's doing the work, whether or not you know it. So what can you do about this? Well, one thing you can do is have really good rubrics, like really good rubrics that you can actually use to guide your decision. Implicit biases are able to take hold when you have to act quickly or when you have to act without a lot of guidance. Finding ways to make guided decisions, finding ways to take time for your decisions, these are the kinds of things you can do to do something about them.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense, given that what we're compensating for is the automatic associations that are just wired in, baked in, I guess might be a better way to put it. And so it seems like part of an intervention then, if we want to take responsibility for the harm that our implicit biases might do in hiring choices or other decisions that we make in our life, is for all of us to accept, for all of us to learn about how our minds work, about how rapid those associations are. And it doesn't have anything to do, it's not about being a good person or an objective person. It's not about wanting to be fair. It's about recognizing that this is simply how we perceive the world, that we're kind of wired to make these rapid associations, and they're there. And it's when we pause that we'll have the chance to recognize that we've made an association, or as you eloquently put it, we need to understand that if we're given a limited amount of time to make an either-or choice, then our implicit biases are likely to be operating whether we're aware of it or not. They're just going to be there. Have I understood you, Noel?
That's exactly it, yes.
Okay. Yeah. And then I know that something you've thought a great deal about is the moral responsibility that we all have for understanding implicit bias and for the harm that our biases can do. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit. I know that you've written extensively on this, and so it's not fair to ask you, give the brief version. But I am interested in if you could just talk about your view of how it becomes a moral issue for us.
Okay, yeah, so part of my research on moral responsibility for implicit biases comes from a kind of puzzle with the way we think about responsibility that implicit biases really bring to the forefront. But I'll start with a more commonplace example. So here's a thing we tend to think about responsibility. It's your fault if you do it on purpose. It's not your fault if it isn't. Or it's your fault let's just leave it at that. If you cause the action, you're responsible for the action. Well, there are some actions that we hold you responsible for that not only did you not cause, you can't cause them. An example would be something like forgetting. Say that you're supposed to get me the paper at X time and then you don't because you forgot. Well, forgetting can't be something you do on purpose, like by definition. But we hold you responsible for forgetting. What's going on in these kinds of cases? I'm concerned about figuring that out because I think once you understand that, you're then able to say, can we hold each other responsible for our implicit biases?
Yeah.
There's some unconscious automatic things we hold each other responsible for. Where do you draw the line? And the answer that I want to give is that where that line is depends on what we owe one another in the relationships we have to one another. So, for example, it might be the case that if you're a very good coworker who always gets stuff in on time, this one time forgets, that it wouldn't be very kind of you to like get on them about that. Like, it seems like that's an honest mistake. By contrast, suppose that it's very important to you that your spouse remember your birthday and that both of you do this and that they forget. That's the kind of relationship where you can be like, I needed you to remember and you forgot. And they can't say like, it's not fair of you to ask that of me. You're close enough that you can demand more. So I think the question that we need to understand when we ask, are we responsible for implicit bias, is what do we owe each other in the kinds of places where this comes up? To be honest, right now, this is a new enough area that I don't think we've established social norms here. I think this is what we have to do. And this is why I care about implicit bias training in workplaces, because I think now is the time to make it the case that this becomes something we can be responsible for. Once people are in the position to know about the biases, to know how they affect us, then it becomes the case that, say, because of your bias, you don't hire someone who deserves the job. It's not just that they're unhappy that they didn't get it. They can think, I deserved better from you, and be right about that.
Yeah. So it's really an opportune moment for a call to greater consciousness
exactly.
among all of us. Because now we know that implicit bias exists. We know a lot because you've been describing the research on it about how it works. And so it becomes really a question of being thoughtful about what our responsibilities are to ourselves and to one another, and taking on that kind of responsibility to understand and explore. And it's an active field, is what you're saying right now. So, well, that kind of brings us to your current job. If it's all right for me to ask you, I'm really curious. I know that you're the Diversity, Belonging, Inclusion, and Equity Program Manager at the Trustees. And in full disclosure, I'm also a part-time summer employee of the Trustees at Castle Hill. It's a wonderful organization. And Noel, I am just curious to find out, what does a diversity, belonging, inclusion, and equity manager do? What's your mission, and how do you prepare for a role like that?
So I'm the DBIE program manager at the Trustees of Reservations, and a big part of what this involves is looking at how we currently do things in all kinds of areas over the organization and asking what's a way to be more equitable when we do it? What's a way to be fair, to be more just, to make what we do more open to other people? As a result, the kind of work I do just sort of happens all over the place. So for example, I advise on a lot of our marketing materials that go out. I help with inclusive hiring, volunteer recruitment. I'm an advisor on a lot of the programming that happens on the properties when it's for holidays like Martin Luther King Day, Women's History Month, Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month coming up. And the way you prepare for this work is, part of it is just having a good idea about what are the kinds of things that we can change to make things better for everyone. But a good part of it is just understanding, I guess, organizational logistics. I have a deep background in program management while I've been doing my doctorate. And so understanding how organizations come together to do things, to understand how they can do them better, is a big part of my work. I was a diversity consultant for a couple of years before I got this role. So, and in addition to finishing my doctorate, I'm also finishing my certification to be a certified diversity executive. So there exists
Oh,
training for this kind of role.
oh, excellent, excellent. From what you're saying, it sounds as though what you're bringing is an educated eye, especially knowing as much as you do about implicit bias. It enables you to look at everything from marketing materials to programming with an eye toward belonging, inclusiveness, and equity,
Yeah.
and then to raise any concerns that you might have. So that's really interesting, Noel. Thank you for that. I've always been curious about it. And I'm also curious, I would love to get your take on the concept of belonging as it impacts the type of work that you do, people's experiences at different places within an organization or a place like the trustees, or there are many, many different sites that people visit. The original title, I believe, for the type of job that you have didn't have the B in it. It was DIE, diversity, inclusion, and equity. And belonging has been more recently added. And this is intriguing to me because I've thought about what it means to feel a sense of belonging, and there's a lot of factors to it, and it's a very subjective sense. And so I'm curious to get your insights into what the dimension of belonging has, why it was felt to be needed, and what dimension has it brought to the type of work that you do?
Yeah, so I'd love to talk to you about belonging. To do that, I'm going to have to talk about diversity, inclusion, and equity also. It's okay.
Sure, of course.
You know, my role involves a very large, confusing acronym. So sort of like getting at what these letters mean and why they're important.
Yeah.
It's I'd say historically the process went something like this. In the diversity managers started being a thing much more after once integration, racial integration started to be more a focus of businesses in the 60s. And at the time, the focus was just on hiring. It was this question of like,
Yeah.
How do you go about and hire non-white talent for all kinds of roles? Around the 80s, the focus shifted to diversity and inclusion because the focus shifted from just hiring talent to retaining talent. It was not just this question of how do you hire people, but how do you hire people and get them to stay? When you hear diversity and inclusion without any other letters, a lot of times what that means is hiring and retention. Equity has become more of a focus in the past 10 years. And the reason for that is that it's not just enough to have a diverse hiring pool and have candidates that want to stay here. You want to make sure that your non-majority group candidates get the same kind of experience, the same sorts of pay raises, the same sorts of promotions and mentorship. So equity has become a focus for that reason. At the trustees, I'd say belonging is a big part of what we do, just because so much of what I do is outward facing. DEI is traditionally constructed as primarily an inward facing role, having to do with workplace operations. Belonging is about making sure that everyone who's involved with the trustees, employees, members, visitors, our governance board, feels like they have a place here. Not just that they're allowed to be here, but that this place is for them. That's why, we have a You Belong Here campaign that is about letting people know, like, our properties are for you. If you have never stepped on a nature trail before, we have places for you to come to that will help you feel like the trustees is for you. So belonging and inclusiveness, it's easy to get them mixed up. One way to think about the difference between them is that inclusiveness is feeling like you're part of what's going on. Belonging is feeling like you belong there. Inclusion is about being part of the plans. Belonging is about being a place you can go to and feel welcome.
Yeah, thank you for that, Noel. That's very helpful, and I appreciate the kind of historical narrative about how the ideas and the practices have evolved over time to become more expansive. It makes me wonder what's next after belonging, because surely something will be, and you may be the one to lead us there. So this has been extraordinarily helpful, Noel. It was everything I hoped it would be. I've learned so much from you, and your examples were really wonderful. They bring the ideas home. And so I thank you for that. It's been wonderful to talk to you.
It's been great to talk to you. Thank you so much for inviting me here. And yeah, I care so much about implicit bias. I really think that over the past couple of years, there's been a real resurgence of interest in doing something about this. And I am also looking forward to seeing where things go from here. So.
Well, when we've all figured out, you come back.
Okay.
And we can talk about the further evolution of DBIE, and I will love doing that with you. Thank you so
I'll do
much,
my
Noel.
best.
It's been wonderful.
Have a
to
nice day.
you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. You too. Thanks for watching, everybody. I hope you'll join us next Thursday at 9 on Channel 9 for the morning show. If you missed any part of today's show, it'll be available for viewing on Port Media's YouTube channel playlist for the morning show at ncmhub.org. Each show will also air on WJOP FM 96.3 on Friday at 8 a.m. and the following Tuesday at 4 p.m. and Wednesday at 3 p.m. and will be available as a podcast on the SoundCloud. Just go to ncmhub.org and click on the cloud icon in the upper right-hand corner and scroll down. Bye, Noel. Thank you so much.
Bye.